This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I am the host, Andy Steele. Guest tonight is Henry Maclean. He's been an architect for a couple of decades now, and he was one of the people that was supposed to be speaking at the business meeting at the AIA convention a few weeks ago in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, of course, all the discussion about the World Trade Center 7 resolution that was being voted on was cut short. So he didn't get a chance to. Well, he's going to be talking tonight, talking about the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence from his perspective and the future overall, what we need to do to get this issue recognized by architects everywhere and the general public too. So I'll be playing that interview for you in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
If we're in a free country, why are we afraid to just talk about an event that was the most traumatic event in our history? I originally believed the official story. I aggressively defended it. When I first started cracking open that little window that there could be possibly more to this story, I went through every emotion, just like probably a lot of you here who didn't originally believe it or consider it are going through. And I didn't want to believe it. I came up with every excuse not to believe it.
Any building that succumbs to fire, that collapses, starts usually with large gradual deformations, and the building will begin to fall over, not straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. These buildings exploded. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions.
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah. Like lava.
Like lava.
From a volcano.
This is all direct evidence of explosive controlled demolition. Interesting thing is fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10.
If the FDNY and other firefighters start speaking out about this is going to explode, and it's going to open a lot of people's eyes to what really happened. Make this a normal thing to talk about so that this will spread like wildfire. It's starting now. From speaking out and starting this website and meeting Richard and a lot of the other incredible people here tonight, I've also met some military intelligence officers that have taught me a lot. And I asked one of them, how do we win? We can't get through the media. We can't get through most of our friends and family because it's too scary to talk about. How do we do this? And he said, it's easier. You just shine the light. And he said, just come from a place of love and not fear. Shine the light.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Henry Maclean is an architect, educator, and licensed builder. He has a BS in environmental design from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a B.Arch from Boston Architectural College. He began his career as a project manager with a number of large architectural firms in Boston before he started his own firm, which is called Timeless Architecture, back in 1988. He currently teaches at the Boston Architectural College and their Sustainable Design Institute and Master's Program. He'll be talking a little bit more about that and other things today. Henry, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate being here.
Yeah, and he was also one of the people that was at the AIA conference, or convention, I should say, in Philadelphia a few weeks ago, so we'll be talking about that. But before we get into 9/11 and get down to business, I want our audience to know more about you, so please elaborate on your background. Tell us more about yourself.
Well, let's see. I come from a background that so I was traveling a lot as kids. I grew up actually in Honolulu, and I think sort of gleaned a sense of care, understanding, and concern for the environment being out there in the 60s, actually, between 59 and 70 when we moved. And so we saw Hawaii change quite a bit, and I think for a lot of reasons that sort of led me to become involved in environmental design in my earlier years. And then as a builder for many years, I decided I also wanted to be designing, so I enrolled in architecture into my late 20s and went through the BAC, which is a great program here in Boston, work-study program that I ended up teaching at a couple of different times. And I lecture there occasionally now. I'm not currently teaching there, but I was about 2-3 years ago. So, but I'm still active in the community. And I've been a long-term member of NESI, Northeast Sustainable Energy Association, which is full of builders, architects, engineers, focused on sustainable design and building. Been in that group for now about 25 years. And then I've been active as well in the Boston Society of Architects, which is one of the larger chapters of the AIA here in the New England region, mostly Eastern Mass and Boston.
So I'm really curious about this because you focus on sustainable design. What kind of factors do you take into consideration when you're designing buildings that some architects may not when they don't have these kinds of concerns?
Sure. Well, the standard elements of LEED, which leadership in energy environmental design, that was pretty much adopted by the AIA maybe back in the mid-90s, focuses in on issues of sustainable sites, water, energy, air quality, both inside and out, and materials and resources. So there's a program. I'm actually a LEED certified architect, and people in this area of study in NESI and other groups have long adopted NESI as sort of a new protocol for making buildings as green as possible. There's other programs that have come along in the last 5-10 years, like the Living Building Challenge, which takes those elements a step further and gets involved in issues of equity and beauty, if you will, a bunch more sort of concerns that get into the more social issues, and but again, sort of well-rounded components. I mean, I like to see architecture respond to what I describe to my students as physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual level. So we carry around with us these 4 different components, in my estimation, on a daily basis when we inhabit buildings and we make buildings. So we're constantly thinking about, how does it respond to people's comfort, safety, but also, emotional basis, and even a more spiritual basis, which is where, the great works of architecture that we study have focused, is tuning people in to themselves and to the larger community that, we all belong to.
Yeah, it's so funny that, in general, the public doesn't think about these types of things unless you are involved in building construction or an architect or an engineer. But we spend so much time in buildings, it's no wonder that so much consideration goes into the style and all of these other aspects, the comfort, and what how the design contributes to a person's comfort within the building, and then all the sustainable stuff that you were talking about. A lot of thought goes into these buildings, and in particular, of course, as we talk about on this show, a lot of thought goes into keeping them from falling if fire breaks out in them. In the case of Building 7, we're told, but we know better. So we're going to get to 9/11 now. How did you come across this issue about the problem with the official story of what happened to the buildings in New York? What made you wake up to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence?
Well, actually, the funny story is that, back in 2005 or 6 or whenever the movie Loose Change came out, my stepson told me all about it and said, I really ought to look into it. And I kind of poo-pooed them and said, that's ridiculous. And it really wasn't until, I'm a latecomer to all this, and as a matter of fact, about 2.5 years ago, I think I saw the short 15-minute film with Ed Asner and AE 9/11 Truth, and I couldn't quite believe it. I think I watched it 4 or 5 times and then watched experts speak out and started talking to people and got involved maybe close to 2 years ago with the Boston 9/11 group that's been very active here and supporting AE 9/11 Truth for many years. So it's been a couple of years, but since I've had this sort of strong connection with running programs both for NESI workshops, symposia, and for the BSA, and teaching at the BAC, I felt this sort of immediate kind of need to share this information and talk to people about it. And funny thing was, I was asked to give a presentation at Simpson, Gumpert, and Hager, consulting engineers, back in 2013 on whole systems. And a good friend of mine there was colleague I'd worked with in a large firm a few years back, and I spoke to about 100 engineers on whole systems and thinking and a variety of things, and then found out about a year and a half later that SGH was one of the firms hired by NIST to actually do the research with FEMA and NIST on the actual 9/11 reports. So, those kinds of relationships have in my life have been tested a little bit since I've sort of come to this understanding of what I firmly believe now is the absolute truth about how those buildings came down, described by AE 9/11 Truth.
Now, has this ever caused any very apparent conflicts, other than just sort of conflicts within yourself? Has this ever manifested your knowledge of this issue with your professional and academic career?
Well, it's not something that I've been able to, or push on with people who don't want to hear about it. I mean, I've brought it up to certain groups. I've written now 3 blogs for the NESI, online blog site, and have basically, we were successful last year to bring this into the annual conference at the AIA, the BSA, Boston Society of Architects, ABX show. And Richard Gage was here, last fall. We had Richard and the team, and 36 volunteers from the larger Boston area, the Boston 9/11 group, and many BSA members as well. So I think there is a slow waking up process going on, and that's encouraging. Sure, we've had some heated debate and conversations with longtime friends who can't get their heads around this, but I think it's a little bit like water on a stone. And I think that sort of bears out in the results that we had in Philadelphia last week, where we're now up to 10% or 11%, I guess, of the delegates there voting in favor of opening up, new investigation.
That's right, and I think that the tide is slowly turning. I had Ted Walter on the show last week. He's our director of strategy here at AE 9/11 Truth, and just for the second year that we've submitted this resolution to get boosted up to 11%, when all you need is 50% for it to pass, is really good, and we're just getting started here. So I want to know from you, you dismissed the idea for a number of years, you said, when your stepson brought it up to you. You watched the Ed Asner movie that was like a key turning in a lock. You watched the other movies put out by AE 9/11 Truth. What piece of evidence really stands out to you that really convinced you and got you to the point now where you're coming to the AIA to represent us?
Yeah. I think I'm a builder's background as well as, being an architect. I sort of got into architecture from putting things together as a kid, and I did a lot of, work in the field. So I'm I'm pretty conscious about, what it takes to put up a wall, what happens when a wall, drops suddenly because there's not a support underneath it, or when I do renovations in my practice now, which is mostly residential, and we pull out a section of foundation, an old foundation, and all of a sudden it lets go, and there's that sort of immediate, you get the sense of what free fall is about. I think that aspect, coupled with the fact that, I'd long believed that, as most of my colleagues and friends have, that there was this sort of plunger effect happening in the towers, for instance, with the upper 15 floors acting as a battering ram. And if you've ever, spent time with just a hammer, you don't even have to be a carpenter, and hit a nail and know what happens to that hammer when it hits the nail. It bounces back up, and you don't see any of that in fact, you see the absolute pulverization of those upper 15 floors. By the time they hit the 90th floor, it's all going, in the same direction, no response. So, just the fundamental physics of it, and it's sort of a visceral thing when you, again, I was describing this to a friend or a colleague about, being architects. We actually have to produce what are called demolition drawings. We take things apart when we do a lot, and I do a lot of renovation. So we're responsible for that, and so that's, I think those elements there have sort of just pushed me to the point where there's sort of a level of standard integrity that you have for a profession, and I speak as an architect, but I'm sure this is true, for pilots who study this, military officers who've studied some of the elements of this, lawyers, medical professionals, religion. I think it goes across the disciplines, in all honesty. But certainly the architects and the engineers, in the face of the fact that these were buildings that were destroyed, are responsible in a sense, or consider the responsible ones to certainly hold the kind of opinion that would eventually sway public opinion in calling for a new investigation. So, that help explain it a little bit?
Well, certainly. It just shows that you know what it takes to put these buildings up, what it takes to bring them down. You have the professional background necessary to talk about this expertly. That's why we're happy to have you here. And you mentioned people's silence. You kind of alluded to that. What do you think is the biggest thing holding architects back from looking into this information more? Because a lot of them get approached, and a lot of them don't want to even deal with it, from my experience. What do you think's going on there?
Well, I think, architects in general tend to be fairly busy people if they're active, if they are busy. It's almost like you are, as an architect, you really never know everything, but what you do know is you have a system of where to look. So when a new problem presents itself, you have a bit of a process to dig and research, and then there's the sort of the intuitive response you have in terms of design. But I don't know. I think a lot of my colleagues who struggle with this struggle with the fact that they believe the government that we pay taxes to and we support, and many of us, we all respect and love, in a sense, our American way of life. Can't imagine that there'd be forces within that who would do us harm, and so I think that's a huge piece of this. The other piece is certainly the stigma that comes with being different or exposed. If you're, and I don't talk a lot about this with my residential clients. I don't necessarily think they're that interested. But I'd say as if I were running a firm and I had 10 employees, which I don't, but if I did, and I was attracting corporate clients who had to keep a certain level of protocol with the larger world, you might not want to be exposed, and so I can see the reason for a lot of people, heads of firms. On the other hand, leadership is leadership, and in people, and being committed to something. I mean, I made the analogy to what we went through 30 years ago when I started co-chairing one of the co-chairs of the Committee on the Environment back in the early days when we were focused on sustainable design, and it really wasn't a very popular thing to be supporting. In fact, there were a lot of people who were, and a lot of people today, as we know, in the Republican Party, denying climate change. But 30 years ago, it was really a much worse situation. So, I have experience, I think, standing up for things going back to that time, and I do see the analogies of, those who talked about climate science as being a sort of conspiracy rather than, delving into the scientific rigor that is required and incumbent on all of us when we're looking at these issues.
And it goes to show you that if you just keep talking about something, more people get informed and start sharing your views. This is true for any topic. There's been a lot of things throughout history, even going back hundreds of years. The example we use a lot of times is Galileo and his supposed theories on what how the universe was laid out, or rather our galaxy, and the claims that the galaxy revolved around the Earth, when in truth it was the other way around, and that's what he was talking about. And it took years for the establishment to come around and agree, because the scientific evidence showed that. So I think that we're so limited with our scope of sight here as humans, because our lives are so short, that we tend to think that nothing is ever going to happen, that you're never going to wake people up because life is so short. But if we keep at it, we can affect generations, and when we wake them up to something like this, that sends ripples out in the pond of human thought, and affects other issues too, because if people look at this, they look into other things as well. And we have a tremendous impact in that way.
And the AIA itself, really did play a major leadership role in this whole process of shifting the way we think about, energy, again, materials, all the elements of LEED that I mentioned earlier, back in the mid-'90s. So I think architects, have sort of a latent desire to step out on this. I think but it offers a major conflict, because we've all been fed the official story, and it's probably going to still take some time for that to wear off.
Well, what do you think about the fact that a lot of architects don't even know about Building 7? This still amazes me, because if you were to believe the official story, right, then this would be one of the greatest structural failures in modern history. It seems like it would be studied inwards and outwards from every angle to prevent something like this from happening again, if you wanted to believe the official story. But when I talk to people at AIA and just generally talk to architects, a lot of them don't even know about this building. I mean, what do you think about that as an architect?
Well, I think we're media-driven, and, we all spend a lot of time on computers, watching television still, getting data from a screen. And when you have, I think we've got a problem in this country where we've got a media, and the history of this goes back to the 50s and the Dulles brothers using the media as a political tool to form public opinion, starting with the whole way in which we created the Red Scare during the Cold War. So I think we're unfortunately at the, Dan Rather's wonderful commentary on Building 7 coming down is only there on the, on the net or in the alternative media. They've never been shown on CNN or ABC, and but hopefully hopefully we can get to the point where enough people are feeling strong enough about this so that a NOVA or a something like the Spotlight phenomena that just came out, the movie on with the letting the Catholic the cat out of the bag with the Catholic Church, and that happened here in the Boston Globe with a Spotlight group who finally broke through. And it's probably thousands of times more difficult with this issue because you're not talking about one independent group who had a unfortunate series of events happen, and then this big cover-up for decades. You've got everybody and their brother involved in this issue because 9/11 really affected everybody, and continues to be this major source of focus on on this whole concern of terrorism in our culture that certainly is there on a certain level, but a lot of those myths are going to unfortunately get turned on their head when the reality shows that in fact it wasn't just 18 hijackers. Now we don't know that. I mean, maybe it was 40 or 50 hijackers, and the others set the bombs in the buildings. But the fact that our government has the official report saying that it was a fire, there's a problem. So we all know this, but then that gets doubled down on by the media. So there's going to have to be some other pieces of this that are going to fall. I mean, we just don't know, but it's. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andy.
No, that's okay. No, you're fine. Because I just wanted to interject how this really struck me in the very beginning when I first started waking up to this, and I didn't have a dog in the fight whatsoever, but I thought the questions I saw on the internet were really reasonable. I thought people like Stephen Jones, the physics professor from BYU, was a very reasonable, very honorable and worthy of listening to type of guy. And to see how the media would react to these questions, and to see how they took what should be a simple discussion, like we're having right now, and they turned it into a screaming match. You'd see people getting yelled at for talking about this, and then obviously what happened to the movement overall is your defense mechanisms kick in and people started yelling back, and it just set the whole issue off on the wrong foot for so many years, maybe on purpose, I don't know, but I see that in a difference between how many people, Americans who are skeptical of our position, react, and people from other countries. It seems to be more civil in some cases from people from other countries, maybe because the emotional baggage isn't there. I don't know, but I really noticed that.
Yeah. Well, it's true even with, as I mentioned, the colleagues and friends I have over at SGH, for instance, when I mentioned to them that, and they were part of the official investigation, dated somewhat, and the people that I know, they're, working, 7, 8 years after this all happened. But certainly, if your firm was involved in developing, the background data and analysis of what took place, and you're asking that be reconsidered, they're not going to be very partial to essentially saying, okay, we'll go back and open up the books from 10 years ago, particularly when it's a government, official study that has been completed, and the government, official version is widely accepted. But this whole issue of dialogue is, and I've been trying to develop this over, we suggested having a session at the ABX show where we had a pro and con, and some of those people would come on stage and talk to some of the people like Richard Gage and others, and we haven't been successful at getting that. It's because you're right, it brings up all this emotional baggage, whether they're involved personally in a personal loss, which I know other people, colleagues, friends working at the New York Times who don't want to talk about this because they have friends, and they don't dialogue. They basically shut down. They basically say, no, we can't have a conversation. That's too preposterous. The problem is it's not preposterous at all. It's quite evident, self-evident as you look at this stuff. The other person I really respect, and having read some of his work, is David Ray Griffin, and the fact that he comes at this from the background, my father actually is a educator and was a part-time minister. He ran Episcopal school when I was a kid, and so I always saw him sort of up there on the pulpit as well as being a headmaster in the school. But David happens to remind me a little bit of my dad, I suppose. But the way he approaches this from a very sensible standpoint, with all the details that, of course, we need to look at, is the kind of thinking that we all need to have more of, I think. So I'm encouraged by everyone that I've read that and people that I've seen through the AE Truth network, and again, we just have to sort of continue along this road. I'm feeling sort of a part of this group right now, but it's been relatively new.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're happy to have you, and I want to talk now about the AIA conference. Now, the audience, if they follow the show regularly, heard last week's show with Ted Walter, where we described the events sort of in sync in chronological order, but I want to get the perspective of all the people who were there, and you were one of the people that was supposed to speak, but I just want to get your take and perspective on what happened there at AIA through your eyes.
Well, I actually went up and spoke to I'm trying to think of the president, Russell Davidson, I believe, afterwards, just saying I was sorry that we had to shut down conversation because I was all the way from Boston, wanted to share what I had to say, and his feeling was that I guess there had been so much contention and angst in the event a year ago that they were, I think, bound and determined before this really got going that they were going to shut it down. That's what it seemed to me. And they figured and I don't know how they arranged it. I was actually standing at the mic and pulled back a little bit so I could see Richard on the jumbo screen. And then when I looked back in front of me, someone had cut in front, and I said, "Oh, that's okay. I'll just get to have the last word. If he's pro or con, I didn't know where he would be coming down." And then they had someone just... I never got, by the time it came around again, it had been shut down, so there was only 4 mics. But, I mean, it's unfortunate. Again, it's I don't know, as a situation where a business meeting with 5,000 people is on such a contentious issue is going to be the place where you can have a dialogue that doesn't become a shouting match or an uncomfortable situation. I'm not sure anybody really can get clear in that kind of environment, almost like a boxing ring. The way the whole place is set up for those listening, that you had an auditorium that fit 21,000 people, and in the center was a ring, essentially, the center ring with, and of course at the business meeting there were only 5,000 people there, but it's still this sort of vacuous space that was dimly lit. You could barely read your piece of paper in front of your face. And so it wasn't engaging, and I would think that the problem is the contentious nature of this, and there's not much you can do about it, I suppose. But I was thinking that if I were the president of the AIA and reaching out and entertaining this resolution, and knowing that there were 97 AIA members signed on to that thing, sponsors, and I saw 3 or 4 people at mics in front of me, I might have said, well, before we shut this down, are there any people on that list who have come all the way to Philadelphia who want to share? And but that's not the way it was set up to be. It was meant to be highly contentious, and I think shut down from the start, unfortunately.
And you said that the guy who essentially budged ahead of you was the guy that came to the microphone and said, I was there last year, or I was not there last year, but I was there on 9/11, and so it was that guy, and then that you never got a chance to speak because they shut down.
Right, next mic, and I think the next person said, I move that we shut down debate, and all he needed was a second, And then he got the second, I think, from the audience, and then basically it was, okay, we're taking the vote. So, and they took the vote, and it didn't get the it didn't get the 1/3 essentially that would have blocked it. It got over 2/3. That's all it needed. So, again, it's Robert's rules. I think they played the game as the game is played, but I think had we known, and some of us had been a little bit more on top of what they were about to do, we probably would have made sure we were at the mics, and maybe a couple more of us would have gotten heard. I'm not so sure it would have changed the vote, but it would have felt better for a few of us to have been able to share.
Well, it's funny you describe it like a sporting event, like a boxing match. I think people might think I'm being dramatic last week when I described it like the feeling before the end fight of a Rocky movie. But no, that is exactly what it felt like, and people had talked about being nervous, people who were not going up to the microphone to speak, and I thought, oh, nervous, come on, get out of here. But I wasn't speaking, and I walked in there and I was nervous for the people that were speaking on our behalf. The feeling you got just from the overall conference, walking amongst other architects, I know you said you spoke to the president there. Did you speak to any other architects outside of that?
I actually spoke to the secretary afterwards as well, and I shared my concerns with him as well, saying that it would have been a more useful process to have a conversation that didn't just have two statements pro and two statements con, and I think they heard that too. The other curious thing about that was that this year there were only I guess there were more resolutions last year. This year there were only 3, and the first 2 were pretty much done in about 10 or 15 minutes. So it wasn't that they had to scurry through this so quickly. There was time, but I don't know. I think the feeling of the conference. I've been to maybe 3 or 4 AIA national conventions. We've had a couple here in Boston that I participated in. The national goes every year to a different city, and every year we have our AIA BSA conference, which I've been involved with. And that's closer to maybe, 8,000 people instead of 20,000 people. So, or maybe 10 last year. So it's more of an airport scene over there where you don't quite know as many people. And but there are a lot of good sessions that I went to, and I spoke to a lot of really good people at the booth with you, Andy, and others there. So I felt that the energy was much more, in some ways, receptive on that floor than last year when we were at ABX, which I think it was a more contentious feeling at ABX too, and it's a really, I think it's a really delicate balance because as you're talking to people and trying to engage them, you have to be a little forceful in the sense to get the point across, but you can't sort of go overboard. So there's a real balancing act, and you probably know this quite well, having been in this for a few years, or as long as you've been in it. But I'm kind of new to it, and I'm always sort of remarking on the nuances of how this whole thing works. We did a really good session actually at back in January. We have a colleague, one of the group here in Boston, is retired now, but is forensic accountant who is responsible for basically counting all the nuts and bolts of a contract, that might be under, disagreement or being reviewed with a contractor and an architect. And he's the guy that basically pulls out all the extra money that the contractor might be asking for. And had a long relationship with a good-sized firm here in Boston, Cambridge, actually, HMFH. And so Tony Lee invited me to join him to speak there on 9/11, which we did early January. And we had about 30 people in the firm present, and Tony talked a little bit about his background as a captain in the military and Navy, I think, and then his many years at Yale and training, and just gave his sort of personal understanding after we got a sense of his background and what happened in 9/11, and then we showed the Ed Asner film, and anyway, we ended up with about a quarter of the people signing the resolution, including the one of the principals there, who was also a past head of the BSA. And so I think those kind of, experiences where you can have a one-on-one or with a small group will just work a lot better to helping people understand, how this might have happened, but also, seeing it from the eyes of those who've been through it and examined it. And I think, going back to Experts Speak Out and the Ed Asner film, those are wonderful films because they really portray people who are just doing their job in a really honest and frank way, sharing the facts. And that's just kind of what we have to keep doing. So, but anyway, that was a good experience in doing that, and I think we're going to try to do more of those with the group that we have here in Boston, lunch and learns, and events where we can speak to committees. There's committees at the Boston Society of Architects that we're focusing in on to give a presentation, and so it's exciting. It's exciting to be part of this, and I mean I think liking it to a friend. I'm not sure who. I think it was Tom Spellman who mentioned Spotlight in the analogies and parallels to that whole event. It's a horrible, reality of abuse that these priests of, all the. There's a great interview with Mark Ruffalo, who portrays the Boston Globe researcher who helped spill the beans on this, and one of Mark's comments about this is just that these priests were like God, and in a sense that's what our government, the official NIST version is a little bit like God, and so you're kind of having to wrestle with something that's much bigger and shouldn't be wrestled with in some ways. But the payoff is that healing will come, real healing, and that's kind of what we need. And so, to me, that ties right back to sustainability, because looking at the aspects of the really bad situation that we had with energy and climate and pollution, back when I was growing up in Hawaii and studying all this environmental design issues in the 70s at University of Massachusetts, and then having to teach that in the 90s, it's a hard thing to tell people about this stuff, but what's the option?
It's difficult, too, because you're delving into something that gets really technical when it comes to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence, other than looking at Building 7 and saying, hey, that looks like a controlled demolition. You're dealing with something that the other side can just go on TV, wear a nice suit, show a slick office background behind them, and say, oh, no, it was this, and, that I'm an expert, so listen to me, or I'm from Popular Mechanics. It's a scientific-y magazine, and don't listen to the people on the internet. And the general public who, by default, wants to believe the official story because there's so much emotionally invested in it, will say, yeah, well, there you go. Look at that guy's suit. Look at Popular Mechanics. It's a scientific magazine, right? They must know what they're talking about, besides the tons of experts at AIA 9/11 Truth. So you're dealing with something that's highly technical in some cases, and you're waging the war in that way, and so it is difficult to get people to, first of all, be interested in the technical aspects of it, and then understand it.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to numbers again. Even to use that Spotlight example again, it's you got to count the number of priests, you got to count the number of victims. There's and that's true with just looking at parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. We've got to there's some rough science, and it's basic stuff that has to be acknowledged and dealt with. So I think one of the other things that I've found in meeting you, but in Richard Gage and Ted and the others in the group, and is that there's this calmness and a sincerity that and willingness to dialogue. And so as long as those things stay the same and not jumping to conclusions, I think it's wonderful that AIA 9/11 Truth hasn't said why, focus on the why and all those, endless, but let the people who know how to do that do it once the understanding is that it calls for a new investigation, and that's a principled and noble way to go forward on this. So that over time, I can see it happening in the last couple of years, and I'm sure others who've been at this for 10 years and longer are certainly seeing it now too, and it gets discouraging. And I've got a lot of family members and my in-laws I'd love to share more with this about, but we're not all on the same page yet. So, and this is where it crosses emotional levels in our own lives, but staying in that, balance of mind, body, spirit, and emotion is important. When you're doing any of this work, it's and when I teach that whole process of, understanding architecture from earth, air, fire, water, mind, body, spirit, emotion, it's encouraging to those who are, beginning the study of architecture to know that there are these bigger patterns that are, fundamental, principles that we have to hold on to, and that's why, in a sense, this has to be challenged, for the integrity of those principles. Buildings don't collapse that way; they can't, and would never by fire. So, it gets back to that, it having integrity, and I think when people see that, and the more architects that tune into this, the more they understand those fundamentals, it'll shift even faster. So that's the hope.
Well, you talk about integrity. This is a question I often ask architects. I want to get your take on it. We've seen throughout history the impact of a political agenda on science, on a profession, because you now have to pretend that this official story makes sense, that a few thermally expanding beams framing into a girder will push it off its seat and cause the entire building to come down in 7 seconds. So what do you think the impact of the official story, not just of Building 7, but of the Twin Towers too, the impact that the official story has on the architectural profession going forward?
Well, I think it's going to be challenged more and more. I think, it's not necessarily. I think the biggest thing that I call into question is what happened to all the concrete. And the fact that you've got you had dust and no slabs. In addition to all the other issues, I think it's if this were an issue that were on people's minds every day or every week. The problem is not. People architects in general are looking for their next job or finishing the one that they've got or bringing in a client or, getting a new system to work on their computers. So it's not like a daily fundamental. But I think as I tend to look in sort of whole systems thinking again that these political, economic, social, and environmental issues are totally intertwined. And so, I think as we all start thinking more holistically, and sustainability and LEED and all these other programs push us to think in systems thinking, whole systems thinking, then, when you start doing that, you start realizing that, yes, it's important to have a sincere and thorough study of one of the largest disasters to happen in our lifetime. I think of the two things of the Kennedy assassination and where I was on 9/11 are things I'll just never forget either one, and they happened close to 50 years apart. So I think it's still something that is on people's minds, even though they like to push it away. Those who haven't really managed to face it yet, to really sit there and take the 15 minutes or the hour and a half to really study the evidence that AIA 9/11 Truth is put forward. And when they do, they'll come around. But getting them to get to that point is, I think, the biggest hurdle in a way. Does that help? I mean, is that answering your question?
Well, it does, just moving forward in terms of what this does with the architectural profession, and I see the problems being that you have a contradiction here. And I talk about this a lot on the show, where, according to the official story with Building 7, for instance, those were very fightable fires in World Trade Center 7. They didn't have the firefighters in there at the time. I think that the circumstances were such that they might have just had seen already the two Twin Towers come down and didn't want to lose any more people. That's what I personally think. But there weren't firefighters in there at the time. But since the fires were fightable, if there was another high-rise that caught fire like that, there would be firefighters in it, and according to the official story now, there's a safety hazard because a few thermally expanding beams can cause the entire thing to come down in mere seconds. You wouldn't want firefighters in buildings fighting fires if this is a reality. So now we've got a contradiction here with the official story existing. So you either acknowledge that huge safety issue that's now been presented to us, or you deal with the fact that it's a controlled demolition. That's one thing that I see as an impact on the architectural profession.
I think the myth that those buildings were essentially substandard, construction, of substandard construction, is what's pervaded the general thinking of those who've said, "Oh yeah, I've looked at that," and I have friends and colleagues of high repute who've in the world of sustainability, and I mean, editors of magazines and organizations that have been around, and they say, "I've looked at the evidence, I've seen it, don't need to look anymore," and won't have the dialogue again. So again, I think that just pushing the dialogue and having this conversation, because of and being in this political year, I'm hoping that as we get closer to the election and people start thinking about terrorism, start thinking about the prospects of having a Donald Trump or even a Hillary or Bernie as president, these issues come up. These issues sort of come to the surface, and so it's a good time, I think, to be pushing on this over the next 6 months, and see how many more people we can bring under the tent.
Exactly, I agree with you completely. So with this show, something we focus on is solutions, doing something about it. You mentioned pushing on the issue, and I always say a million small things done well every single day is what's going to be what wins this war for us, this information war. You mentioned your group in Boston. What are some of the things you do, and what do you think are some of those small things that can be done well every day to get the word out and eventually get us a new investigation for our listeners to do?
Well, again, looking at the model of sustainability, we start with the local, and we work out to the town, and then the city, and the regional, and then national and whatnot. So I've been working with my town as a chair of the Energy Committee, Alternate Energy Committee, and I'm a member of a group called Sustainable Milton in the small town I live in, 20,000 people south of Boston. And so I want to give a talk about this to that group. I want to talk to some engineers and architects I know over at Milton Academy in our town, which is a highly renowned secondary school where a number of people have gone, including the Bushes and our past governors and whatnot. So I'd like to we have a small group that's here right in Milton working on that. It's one of the things we want to do. And then getting out to firms individually, lunch and learn type efforts, so we can go in and give a short presentation and have lunch. And then these committee efforts that we're doing at the Boston Society of Architects, there's a number of different committees, ethics committee, sustainability committees that we want to talk to. So we're trying to set some of those up. And then doing the big show with Richard again next fall. We're hoping, Richard, actually, we have a proposed session into the Boston Society of Architects annual show, the ABX, a real full session. He spoke on the trade show floor last year with 60 people attending, so that was great. Again, we talked to about 1,000 people at that booth last year. 110 signed up. And then larger, we were talking about the possibility of, pulling together some kind of interdisciplinary effort to a symposium and maybe a 1 or 2 day where we try to link in with some of the lawyers, the architects, the pilots, and other groups who've been very active in 9/11 research over the years, scholars, actors, and artists, possibly members of the media. So that's something we're just sort of thinking about now, and possibly pulling together in the next year, or maybe it's a few years away. But because I think certainly architects need to do, and we are doing our part, but this is something that affects every discipline in our country in a way. Every métier, we all have integrity in the sense that was shattered, by the developments of 9/11. Just the mere fact that the attack happened, but the fact that the attack may have been carried out by others other than those who've been given the put in that position of having committed it, whoever they were. I mean, and again, no one yet has been punished for 9/11, which is the other hard thing to believe. But I think at all scales, I'm excited to be working on this. And bringing a sense of humanism to it too, which I think we can do. It's just it's something that I didn't lose anybody there, and I don't nobody from Massachusetts that I knew. But it just goes beyond that, and I think it's just, again, gets back to this issue of integrity for me, and an opportunity, I think, for all of us to to do something good for our, in this case, as an architect, for the discipline that I've been part of for 35, 40 years.
Well, I tell you what, I know that you were doing a lot of good stuff with AE, talking to Richard, and you came down for the AIA conference. It's too bad you didn't get a chance to speak. Hopefully you can get a chance next year if you decide to come down wherever it's going to be. But we're at the end of our time, but thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Free Fall, and I hope we can have you in again sometime.
Andy, thanks so much. Appreciate being with you. Have a great night.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep up with the archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.